Hello, English 9. I'm at the blood drive, so I cannot talk to you in person. So instead I'm going to talk to you this way. So this is typically what happens when you read. You're going to come to class, take a quiz on what you read to make sure that you did read and you understood the material, and then we're going to talk about the chapters more in depth. So this would be a time for you to have your study guide out, to perhaps go over some of the responses. You definitely should always have your book out, and you should have a writing utensil because we will be discussing some things that you need to take notes on, okay? And those notes can take place in your study guide because there's a lot of room for you to do it there. So make sure that you all have your books out, a writing utensil out, and your study guide. And if you don't have your study guide, then take out piece of notebook paper so that you can take notes. The things that we discuss in class will be something that you need to refer back to during later assignments, like on projects or essays that you have to write, because we will be doing writing in To Kill a Mockingbird during this unit. You will also use these notes in preparation for the test. And so it is to your advantage to have your book out, for you to have a writing utensil out. Your study guide should be out, as well as a piece of paper for you to take notes. So if the sub needs to pause the video right now, please do that to make sure that everyone has their book, a writing utensil, and their study guide or notebook paper to take notes on. So everyone will also need to, for this presentation, to take out a separate piece of paper, a full piece of paper, and number it 1 through 4. These will be short answer questions that you need to answer throughout this presentation. You will be handing this in at the end of the hour, and leave yourself enough space to write 2 or 3 sentences in answering each one of those questions. And so I would take the whole page and put number 1 at the top, and then a couple lines down number 2, a couple lines down number 3, a couple lines down number 4. So you will be handing this in to the sub before you leave today, so make sure that you have that out. Again, if the sub needs to pause the video, please do so now so all the students have out their paper to write their responses to this presentation. So as you were reading, you probably realized that some parts were kind of difficult to understand. And that might have been because in the first chapter in particular, there's a lot of background. And honestly, it's kind of boring. There's a lot of information about characters. Sometimes the characters aren't even all that important, or they don't come up later. And so I don't blame you if you had a hard time understanding the first, up to 7 to 10 pages. It can be kind of rough. But you already knew that you would be getting background because that's what the exposition of the story is. There's a lot of background. So I'm going to cover some of the major characters that we were introduced to, and this would be in the first part of your study guide, so page 2, if you wanted to take further notes. So the first person we're introduced to is the narrator. Now, the narrator's full name is Jean Louise Finch, but we almost never hear her referred to that. In fact, the name that we are oftentimes referred to her, that she refers to herself and other characters refer to her as, is Scout. So Scout is just the nickname that she has, and yes, Jean Louise Finch, or Scout, is a female. There are 2 ways that we know that. Number 1, Jean Louise is a female name. That is a female character's name. Also, if you look on page 8, so this would be a time for you to open up your books and turn to page 8. So everyone needs to open up their books and turn to page 8. This is when Scout first meets Dill, and her brother Jem is talking about how old Dill is, and halfway middle of the page it said, "Shoot, no wonder then," said Jem, jerking his thumb at me. Scout yonder's been readin' ever since she was born, and she ain't even started to school yet. You look right puny for going on 7. And so that's indirect characterization telling us that Scout is a female. And this is incredibly important later on in the story as we get through the rest of the book, because her being a female influences how other characters treat her. You'll also recognize, if you looked at, and this is direct characterization, that on page 7, we know how old she is when the story starts. Now, many of you, I understood, were very confused because you read at the very beginning on page, the very first page, that it starts saying that Jem was nearly 13 years old, and so you automatically assume that since he's 4 years older than Scout, that she is 9 when the story begins, and that is inaccurate. When the story actually begins on page 7, it says that she is 6 years old. So it's the second full paragraph on the page. It says, when I was almost six and Jem was nearly 10, our summertime boundaries, within calling distance of Calpurnia, were Ms. Henry Lafayette's Du Bois house, 2 doors to the north of us, and the Radley place, 3 doors to the south. So she specifically says that at this time she is, well, it says she's almost 6, so approximately 5 years old. But if you were to say that she was 6 years old, that would be fine. So she's rather young, and we'll talk more about why we have a narrator that is so young in this story. So Jean Louise, or Scout, which we'll be referring to her as from now on, Scout is the narrator of this story, and we follow her throughout the entire story. We are also introduced to a major character, which is her father, Atticus Finch. Now, we are provided a lot of detail about Atticus Finch and his background, and we also, within the first 3 chapters, learn a lot about him just as a father and as a person. And he becomes a major character. He is a major character throughout the entire book, and that we will frequently be talking about who Atticus is, how does his actions represent what kind of person he is, and how his actions might influence others. So he's a major character that we need to pay attention to. On page 4, so if you turn to page 4 in your books, it describes how Atticus Finch's family is rich. His many years ago, his ancestor from England, Simon Finch, started a plantation and created a huge amount of riches from that plantation. So many years after that, for many years, the Finch family was a very rich family. And they say on the bottom of page 4 and on the top of page 5 that the Finches usually stayed on the plantation and took care of the plantation. But it was Atticus, the first Finch, that chose not to stay on the plantation. So that's first something that we need to pay attention to. You might want to ask yourself, why did he not want to stay? What encouraged him to leave? Why would he want to leave? We also have a lot of evidence that Atticus is a caring individual. The first way that we see this is that he cared for, I suppose this isn't the first way, but it's it references it earlier and later on page 5, that Atticus was an older brother, and Atticus went to law school. But then when he was a practicing lawyer, he saved up his money to help his brother go to school. That's at the very bottom of page 5. It said, during his first 5 years in Maycomb, Atticus practiced economy more than anything. For several years thereafter, he invested his earnings in his brother's education. So he specifically made sure to save up money to help his brother go to school. So that shows that he is a selfless individual, because he could have just kept that money. Instead, he used that money to help his brother go to school. Earlier on that same page, or like on the big paragraph that starts with when my father was admitted to the bar, it also explains why Atticus doesn't really like practicing law in the courtroom. He was a courtroom lawyer, but he didn't like the fact that he couldn't help people, or they were unwilling to help themselves. So in the middle of the paragraph, it says his first 2 clients were the last 2 persons hanged in Maycomb County Jail. Atticus had urged them to accept the state's generosity in allowing them to plead guilty to second-degree murder and escape with their lives. So he was trying to encourage his clients to plead guilty, but they were Haverfords in Maycomb, and in Maycomb County, a name synonymous with jackass. The Haverfords had dispatched Maycomb's leading blacksmith in a misunderstanding, which means that they killed him. And it continues to say that even though they admitted to the killings, they still pled not guilty. And because they didn't listen to Atticus, the law sentenced them to death, and Atticus didn't like that. Atticus didn't like the fact that through law people were killed, and so he refused to practice courtroom law anymore. In fact, what he decided is that he will work with land law, so giving people contracts and things like that. He didn't like the fact that the law was used to hurt other people, so that's a major component of him as a character. And you'll also notice that his children come to him for advice. Multiple times in the first 3 chapters, Scout comes to Atticus and asks him for his advice on things. And we also know that Scout goes to Atticus for help with reading, not help with reading, but that he reads with his children. It's also very interesting in the relationship that he has with his children. If you look on page 41, you'll see this is a conversation when Scout was talking to Atticus about the Ewells, that she refers to her father in different ways, but she never uses the word father. Pay close attention. What does she use to refer to her father? What words does she use? And does that differ from the relationship that you have with your parents or with your guardians? So when I come back tomorrow, I'm going to ask you that question. How do the children talk to their father? How does this denote respect? How does this show that his children respect him? And then finally, a component of him as a character is the advice that he gives his children. So he never lies to his children. He tells them the truth. And he when Scout was talking about how she's unhappy with Miss Caroline, he said, don't judge her too quickly. He said, you never really understand a person until you consider things from his point of view. And then he says, until you climb into his skin and walk around in it. So he's giving the advice to his children, kind of like, don't judge someone until you know about them. Don't judge them until you understand their circumstances. And so he's giving them good advice, and the children know that he's giving them good advice, so they continuously look to him. We're also introduced to Jem. And we know a little bit about Jem. He's the older brother of Scout, and when the story begins, he's approximately, since he's 4 years older than Scout, he would be 10 when the story begins. A major event happens to him when he's 13. You see that on the first sentence of this entire story. So that's a major component, and I'm going to ask you more about that later. But Jem is Scout's older brother, and he is 10 when the story begins. We are also introduced to the character of Calpurnia. Now, do not confuse Calpurnia with the children's mother, that she is not the children's mother. The children's mother died of a heart attack when Scout was 2, and so they don't have a mother. Instead, it describes on page 6, very bluntly, Scout tells us that the bottom of page 6, that Calpurnia was their cook. Okay, and it's important to note that we know that Calpurnia is a person of color because these roles, cook, servant, anything like that, caretaker, was oftentimes filled by people of color. And so Calpurnia is a person of color that's working within the Finch household. But she plays a very important role in the house. And it's very important to note, or to keep in mind, that Atticus trusts her a lot with his children. If you take a look on page 7, it says on the first, right on the top of the page, Calpurnia always won, mainly because Atticus always took her side. That's something important to consider. Calpurnia is a person of color, and Atticus sided with her over his children. That it would be unheard of. And so he puts a lot of trust in her, and he appreciates her despite what color she is. And then on page 33, there's Calpurnia actually smacks Scout for insulting Walter, and Atticus doesn't say anything in response. He's perfectly fine with that response. Now, if anybody did that today, it doesn't matter who you are, if somebody smacked somebody else's children, they'd get in deep trouble. But Calpurnia seems like she's really important to the family. In the next video, I'll tell you more about some of the characters, and we'll review some of the major events that happen within this, within the first couple chapters.